Well, here we are. I've been thinking about something. Uh, it occurred to me during the preparations for Holy Week, etc., and especially Good Friday, and especially remembrances of the past, where the Jews would be mentioned often and in not, very good terms, and then the prayers that used to be said were very derogatory and even insulting, I guess, in some ways, etc. I don't recall exactly what they said right now. The perfidious Jews, that I remember. That's bad enough. So as I'm with my group, that's a very good group of humble, simple people, but who know a lot more about the Bible than most people in the Catholic Church. I did mention more than once that when we hear the Jews, the Jews, the Jews in the Passion readings, etc., that you have to keep in mind that all of these were Jews. I think I said that in my last video on the Passion and Resurrection of Christ, and that Jesus had a large following among the crowds of Jews in Jerusalem, and that the Jewish authorities, wanted to have him arrested, not during the feast, lest there be a tumult among the people, a disturbance. So I think that the Jewish authorities, who were highly connected to the Roman imperial rulers, probably, handed Jesus over, or got to find out where he hid, as I think he did in the Mount of Olives somewhere, and used Judas, uh, to find this out, I guess. And but he was crucified, by the Romans, and we've covered this a lot of times. This is not the topic. The topic is that the Bible is fundamentally cryptic, fundamentally a document that on the surface can be read and quote unquote understood a certain way, but that fundamentally requires delving below the surface. Here you see a, a picture of a cover of a book. That's an old book. This book came out a long time ago, even though I think I got it right after it came out, 1997 copyright. James Kugel. He was at Harvard. I think he moved to Israel, and I hope he's still alive. But it's a great book, and I think he's got a companion book with all the footnotes or all the research he did. It's a very readable book. I highly recommend it. And one of the things that he said that struck me a long time ago is that the ancient interpreters of the Bible, or scholars of the Bible, and this is a book really regarding how the Bible has been interpreted in the ancient world, and some of these stories in the Bible, etc. This guy is incredibly, learned about Judaism, etc. And so he says that there are four assumptions underlying the biblical text, or approaching the biblical text. And so I didn't copy, page 17. But the first assumption is that all ancient interpreters seem to share is that the Bible is a fundamentally cryptic document. And I'm not going to devote this to to discussing James Kugel, but simply to quote him as having this interesting phrase. And really, the purpose of my video today is to discuss how critical thinking and reasoning and research and learning is so important. And it's a very Jewish trait, as I have said numerous times. And it's almost like a symbol of what we should be doing in society regarding people and politics and what they say and just everything. And I think we have reached a point now where this is far from the minds of most people. You need to have, very quick and short segments. Attention spans are not long. I see again people texting and driving, can't drive without looking at the phone. NPR, which is a very soft spoken, intellectual type of radio station, even that I turn off to be quiet in my thoughts. I may be in some ways at the opposite extreme. But the fact is that the Bible and reading the Bible, which is so important to so many people, including priests and the laity, requires the kind of rumination that the rabbis and others have spoken about, going over and over it. The Pope does that very well. Pope Francis, you can tell that he ruminates the Bible. He sometimes gets things wrong. I think he got wrong his explanation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, when he said that the priest and the Levite feared the man was bleeding, the victim of these robbers, and that contact with the blood of the bleeding man would contaminate them, which I found very suspect, because I don't think blood contaminates in Judaism. It's sacred, you can't eat it. Leviticus says that. Menstruating women are incredibly impure, but blood itself, bleeding, doesn't make you impure. Touching that blood doesn't make you impure. So I did research, and I did research with Jewish sources. And I even posted on Facebook. I said I want my rabbi and Talmudic expert friends on Facebook to bear me out on this, or tell me what's going on with this. And the son of a very famous rabbi in Rome, Elio Toaf, his son is Ariel, who I am privileged to have as a friend on Facebook, did write and said, you are correct, the Pope is wrong. Mere blood doesn't contaminate you. But I had done my research on good Jewish sources, that you have to know, what is a good source on the internet. I have a friend of mine who has tremendous physical problems, heart problems, all kinds of medical issues, serious ones, consumes a gazillion medicines, etc. And he said to me, when we discussed, when I look up something medical wise, he goes, "Do you use WebMD or something like that?" I go, "Look, I don't go to one source. I Google the thing and I read from various sources and I get a picture. I just don't say, I can't distinguish a good source from a bad source. So if somebody told me that WebMD was fantastic, and I only use WebMD because any other source I don't know anything about. But when I see Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins or whatever it is, or with any article on Wikipedia, when you see the bibliography, when you see what it's based on, you have to know how to think, and that is something that comes incredibly hard to a lot of people. But to try to stay within the biblical topic, um, it's very clear uh, that most people take the Bible as if it's just history in the kind of sense we have now. And as I had said, I am about to finish the second volume of Raymond Brown's The Death of the Messiah, having read already The Birth of the Messiah. These are all several hundred pages long. And I've spoken about Raymond Brown before, and I've read a lot of his stuff. And, you know, when you read all this stuff, you realize that, um, people really think that the Gospels are something you take literally, and you cut and paste from one gospel to the other. So there was a census in the whole world, and they had to go down. The Holy Family had to go down from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and while they were there, the shepherds came maybe first, and then the Magi came later. So you mix Matthew and Luke, and I used to tell my classes, this is like showing up for Thanksgiving dinner, and the person says, we've pureed the turkey, the cranberry, the stuffing, and the mashed potatoes, and you don't have to, worry about cutting the turkey. You can just, with a spoon, eat the whole meal. It's going to be that way in your stomach anyway. Nobody wants that. You have to look at each gospel. And so if you want to move beyond the most superficial reading, and I'm going to give you an example in a second. If you want to move beyond a very superficial reading, which involves a lot of problems, it's like a generalization. If you say all Cubans are loud, and or whatever other stereotype you want, or all Latin Americans are a certain way, and you can't tell a Puerto Rican from a Cuban, from a Dominican, from a Mexican, from a Nicaraguan, a Salvadorian, etc. Your knowledge is so amorphous, without form, that it can be as bad as it is good, depending on the context. If you say Latin Americans speak Spanish, that's generally true. Not for Brazil, but it's generally true. But and I had a friend of mine that always used to say, he's Spanish, he's Spanish, he's Spanish. And I go, what are you talking about? Spanish to me means he's from Spain. And a Spaniard is like an Englishman being compared to some guy in the Ozarks or something. I don't know. You have to distinguish things. And so regarding Raymond Brown, I wanted to put up this quote where in 2002, Francis Maloney, who became a big expert on the Gospel of John, talking about the recently deceased Raymond Brown, quotes Raymond Brown in his preface to the Gospel according to John, 2 volumes, very classic commentary on the Gospel of John by Raymond Brown. He said in his preface that he claimed that he wished to produce 2 volumes of synthesis directed by one, the desire to present a moderately critical theory of the composition of the gospel. So moderately critical. I think he's a little bit more conservative than I am. And to the conviction that the 4th gospel is rooted in historical tradition about Jesus of Nazareth. And 3, the principle that sincere confessional commitment to a theological position. In other words, as a Catholic, you are committed to confessing, professing the Catholic faith as defined by the magisterium of the church, the teaching authority. So people might say, now I don't really pay attention to that, but a person who is sincerely, confessionally committed to Catholic dogmatic teaching, for example, and who knows what is dogmatic teaching and what is not, can also be perfectly stubbornly in his stubborn in his refusal, his or her refusal to make a biblical text say more, I could add, or less, than its author meant to say. So that you can't twist things to make them conform to your belief. And you get into a lot of sort of gray areas there regarding the Virgin Mary, for example. But nevertheless, I thought this was an interesting quote. Now, one of the examples I can discuss is the temple cleansing in the Gospel of Mark, or in the Gospels. And what people usually do, and this is more detailed than the baptism of Jesus, which is something that they similarly approach. What people usually do is they say, oh, Jesus threw out the money changers from the temple. He was against commerce in the temple. Jesus was against greed. He was against profaning sacred things with money things. And he got a cord, he made a cord of whatever it was, thongs or something, and with a whip he threw them out. It's a very dramatic scene, and even big animals, etc. And says, don't make my Father's house a marketplace. You've made it a den of thieves. Well, there they've mixed up almost all the four Gospels. I think you have an initial account in Mark, which is what I did my doctoral dissertation on, where with hyperbole, Jesus throws out buyers and sellers, meaning everybody, out of the temple. He catastrophizes, overturns the tables of the money changers and pigeon sellers, using the catastrophe verb in Greek, which corresponds to its use in Hebrew for the overturning of Sodom and Gomorrah, terrible destruction. And he would not allow, and no other gospel has this, he would not allow anyone to transport a vessel through the temple. I think of blood vessels. I say he gave the temple a heart attack. And most translations say he wouldn't allow anyone to transport anything through the temple. But in Mark only is the temple act, as I call it, not the cleansing, flanked in famous Markan sandwich or dovetailing fashion by the fig tree. I call it some sort of a fig Newton. Jesus sees a leafy fig tree. It's not the season or kairos, opportune time or divinely appointed time for figs. He says something to the fig tree. Then he goes into the temple, does his thing there. The next morning, they see that the fig tree has dried up from the roots on up. And Peter then describes what Jesus had done as the fig tree that you cursed has dried from the roots up, etc. So the fig tree, with the sandwiching and dovetailing, which is common in Mark, happens with the bleeding woman and Jairus' daughter in chapter 5, etc., allows you to interpret what he's done in the temple correctly. And the protest against commerce is secondary. You needed these animals in good condition near the temple to offer sacrifices. That's what the temple was for. But Jesus does quote two different prophets in Mark. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, Isaiah 56. But you have made it a cave of bandits, Jeremiah 7. The translation then of thieves gets into, like, pickpocket, embezzlers, overcharger type of things, maybe Jewish hinting. Whereas the Peritzim, these guys are bloodshedders, violent men, bandits. Lestai in Greek would be the revolutionary bandits that were crucified with Jesus, according to Mark, and maybe some other gospels have a different word, like Luke has evildoers. From Jeremiah 7, which is a destruction of the temple chapter. Don't rely on the temple while you commit crimes, because my people came from the Shiloh temple with Eli's sons, etc., those banished priests that Jeremiah formed part of to Anathoth. And the Lord can destroy even the holiest place if it has become corrupt. So that it goes way beyond, keep the temple going, rather than not a stone will remain upon a stone, as Mark will say 2 chapters later in Mark 13, or Jesus will say. And it goes into this universalism of Isaiah 56, where eunuchs and foreigners will have access even to the altars of the temple, etc. And he will add, the Lord will add yet others to those already gathered. So if you look at the sort of like a hyperlink, the whole context that Mark is quoting just a verse or part of a verse from, then you get the broader picture. And this is how you should study the Bible. And Jeremiah 7 is a tremendous chapter, the whole thing. And it ends with, the destruction and the desolation of the temple and of the land. This Kugel talks about a lot of this stuff, and mentions various different examples. He's full of knowledge, and one of them, of course, is this intra-biblical. Already inside the Bible, there is Daniel puzzling over what the 70 years of exile or of desolation that Jeremiah predicted, not in chapter 7, but in some other chapters. What does that mean? Because in Daniel's quote-unquote time, more than 70 years had passed, and the angel Gabriel then interprets the two Hebrew words, which are only consonants without vowels, but which can be vocalized, or to which vowels can be added in different ways. He basically says that Gabriel says to Daniel, you have to vocalize this the right way or ways. And it's not really 70 years, but 70 weeks or 70 and weeks and years. meaning 70 weeks of years, meaning 490 years. So multiply 70 by 7 and you get 490, and that is a workable time span to maintain the truth of Jeremiah's prophecy, rightly understood and rightly applicable or relevant to the time of Daniel. Now, I've given you this as an example, not as a mini lesson primarily on Daniel or Mark or anything, but rather as an example of the task that we are called to try to engage in life in general. But I'm limiting myself specifically to the Bible. Because otherwise you get into this superficial, it's all history, and you miss the particular points that each evangelist is trying to make. You know, getting back to the Temple Act, there's 4 different accounts. We've discussed the Markan account. Matthew follows Mark rather closely. He doesn't really get into Markan theology that much. He just thinks it's an important passage to basically quote with differences, with some differences. He usually shortens Mark where he thinks Mark has extra verbiage. Luke has a scene with minimal or no violence whatsoever. Jesus sort of shushes out just the sellers. He doesn't overturn any tables. Very, very minimalistic scene regarding the temple. Luke didn't want to exclude this, but he reduced it to the bare minimum. And in fact, it's entering into the temple. He began to cast out those who sold. Following Mark here, began to cast out his Mark, telling them, "It is written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a cave of bandits." So he keeps that. When you get to John, this is where you have the whip and my father's house a marketplace and the large animals, not just doves. Then the whole discussion is, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. And you have a whole Johannine, precisely kind of like what we're talking about here. You have a whole Johannine parody or ridicule of understanding things too literally, too by the letter. When Jesus says destroy this temple, it must mean that God or troops or somebody are going to raise down the temple. But he's actually using the sort of the background to this, which John may have known from Mark, etc., or even from a prediction of Jesus that the temple would be destroyed 40 years afterwards, which it was in the year 70. And he's turning this into a Christological, sort of soteriological salvation conversation, which the Jews don't understand. He was talking about the temple of his body. Destroy my body, which will be a temple, and in 3 days I will raise it, not build it again. And even the disciples don't understand, They remembered this later, but there are many things that the disciples do not understand until after the resurrection, when the Holy Spirit is given. That's what we should be praying for. So that you have you have the I think the task, the call to delve deeper into these things, because the superficial view of Scripture, which works to a lot, but it's not sufficient. I used to tell my students in the seminary, it's like a house, you know. You have a nice, cozy house, but when you have children or a larger family, you need to enlarge the house. And sure enough, tearing down walls and raising up all that dust and the mess that construction people cause when they, modify a house. Um, Everybody wants to avoid that, but if it's necessary, you have to do it. And so, on the issue of the Jews, um, if you cannot delve into the historical situation of the earliest church, which was almost all Jewish, and you have these bitter debates that are very evident in the Gospel of John, but also in Matthew, you can tell that the separation is taking place or has taken place. Their synagogues. In fact, when Matthew says, do not go to Samaritans or to pagans, etc., go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, I think the point there is to say Jesus came only to his people, and his people rejected him en masse, generally. And then they assume blood guilt. Let his blood be on us and on our children. And then at the end, go out to all the nations, pagan nations, and make them disciples, etc. You have to get into the intentions of Matthew and his community situation. If you don't get into that, you're going to say Jesus was a Catholic, as was Matthew, and their enemies are these non-believing Jews that it took almost 2,000 years till Nostra Aetate in Vatican II highly debated. And here, in context, I guess the Middle East patriarchs were the least favorable to absolving the Jews. Even the most, I think the Melkite guy, I forget his name, the most fantastic council fathers from the Middle East who stood up to Romanism and Ottaviani and all these very conservative people, when it came to the Jews, not that, because of their internecine sort of, violent relations with the Jews. But it took Nostra Aetate in 1965 at the very end of the council to say the Jews are not responsible collectively or forever for the death of Christ. If you're not at that kind of level, and for some people this would say, this is egghead stuff, this is too intellectual, then I think your understanding of the scriptures is poor. There's a nasty quote. I like nasty quotes sometimes, but they're memorable. William Sloane Coffin was on TV. He was a very famous Yale chaplain, and I think he was that famous church in New York, Riverside Church, I think it was, or something. And he says the Bible is like a mirror. If an ass looks into it, he can't come out looking like an apostle. And so I think the Bible is a privileged place in which this very mysterious God of the Big Bang and of the microscopic world too, who is always surprising us. I used my famous little paradoxical line that he's chesed ve'emet. He is both the doer of unbelievably generous, unexpected, surprising acts of loving kindness in a reliable, firm, emet, truthful, faithful, stable, firm way. So instead of saying who knows what he's going to do, well, you can almost say we know he's going to surprise us, but we already know that, and we know the surprise will be in the way of salvation and help, not in the way of, although yes, the punishment of God can be very surprising too. He can be very, very harsh. And I was reading about that recently, I forget where, but the discipline of God can be very harsh. I'm actually reading a book on divine discipline written in 55 by James A. Sanders, a great scholar. And, you know, God teaches us by warning or by having us observe what happens to others when they don't heed warnings, or sometimes with our own suffering and our own, um, you know, sinfulness and being punished for it. And then you get these people that say, oh, God doesn't punish anybody, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, I mean, you can make up your own gospel all you want and whitewash it all you want. The truth of the matter is that there are many, many, many different aspects to these mysterious things. And I prefer to stick to the letter the right way and then explain away. I mean, in the fourth song of the suffering servant, I heard a Carmelite guy in Toledo one time, and I had to say something. You know, Yahweh laid on him the sin of us all, you know, and, you know, go and fatten the hearts of these people so that they don't turn to me. Or I hardened the heart of Pharaoh. To understand that, but if you water that down to make it, you know, an aseptic, politically correct Reader's Digest Bible, you're as bad as the other guys that say onward, you know, Christian soldiers and wipe them out. The extremes touch themselves, and I keep having to go back to that line a lot these days. And so my call is not to just one particular group, it's to everybody. You have to dig a little deeper, one, and two, you have to be open to God's surprises, and they can come in various different ways. If you say, oh, he can only surprise me in ways that I like, then that's where you get this whole business of God as the other reference point that is going to prevent our absolutizing anything. Because whatever we construct as absolute, whether it's political thoughts or ideologies or whatever it is, theories, we are human and limited by definition. And every time something limited wants to be like God, judging everything else like if they were gods, the real God can burst that bubble time and again. And I just wanted to share this. I just thought the idea was interesting that you can't really preach about these readings, especially regarding the Jews, without more sophistication than priests and laity in general seem to have. The default mode for humans is take it literally, don't think too much about it, because, just repeats some platitudes, maybe, comforting thoughts, avoid anything that makes you think. But then those things that are being heard that you haven't been thinking about, the Jews, never get confronted and solved or resolved, because you just buried them to try not to rock the boat, but it's still festering there in the unconscious, as Freud would say. And unless you delve into that unconscious, the conflicts that are in that ignorance or suppressed knowledge or experience don't disappear because you hit your head in the sand. They act out in different ways. And the Lord knows our society is full of people acting out, shooting, because they're freaked out in many ways. And then there are ideologies that pop up that sort of perpetuate the same thing continuing to happen, which is what Alcoholics Anonymous define as insanity: repeating the same thing and expecting different results. And that does not happen.